I studied social history I didn't get my undergrad in it, but I got my master's degree in it. And within social history, I was focusing on women's history, and within that, I was focusing on the history of marriage. But social history is the study of the lives people led. So you're not, and you know this is what we do. We're not studying the battles or the proclamations. We are studying in social history. You study the food they ate, what they drank, how they went to church, how they dressed, what they believed, how they divided the chores among the family, how they kept time, that sort of thing. Because frankly, that's what's interesting. Sorry.
I agree.
No shade to people who like studying specific battles techniques, but this is what I think is fascinating, because the idea of people are people no matter when they are. Humans have been humaning for
since human time.
Yeah, right. Writing historical fiction is applied social history. Okay, so we have learned our social history. We know how they kept time. We know what their chores were like. We know what they dressed. We know how they cooked. And now we're going to apply it by imagining how, okay, is perhaps the, 1300 London, there's a woman named Catherine. This is how she produces dinner for her husband, her family. This is how she dresses. This is what she does on Sundays, that sort of thing. Now we're going to get into her head, because we know how modern Catherine thinks. So we can probably assume, based on this parameters, how historical Catherine thinks. That's what historical fiction is, applied social history. We are just writing historical romance, which is a one step further, and it always ends happily ever after.
Yes.
Right? Historical fiction does not always end happily ever after.
It usually doesn't. Yeah.
You spend 600 pages inside the head of Anne Boleyn.
Yeah.
So I think historical romance is the best kind of historical fiction. I do totally acknowledge that modern historical romances, and I'm not going to say are inaccurate, not at all. What we choose to do are highlight the stories and the characters that are most going to appeal to modern women or modern readers. And it is possible that we could make the argument that those characters and those stories were in the minority in 1300. Like, I mean, the book I'm releasing today is a story of a widowed, her husband was an earl, her 9-year-old son is now the current earl. She's a widowed countess, and she's jaunting about looking for a bodyguard. There were a limited number of widowed countesses in 1300 Scotland. I mean, there's going to be far more stories about the baker's wife who does what she's supposed to do and doesn't raise any eyebrows. However, the widowed countess story is far more interesting. So that's why we tell that story. The badass heroine that goes out and gets what she wants. They were there, and they have been there throughout human history. They're just perhaps not as many of them as there are the behaved women who don't make history, the well-behaved women who don't make history.
Right. And by the way, most women aren't in any history textbooks. So
correct, exactly. Who's writing about the baker's wife? Who does what she's told? Nobody. They're writing about the strong, independent women who kick butt. And one of the things that I have become known for, particularly in my comedies, is my long author's notes at the end. And my author's notes are written in my voice, and I have hundreds of readers who come to me and say that the author's note is their favorite. Some people say they skip to the end and read those first, then read the book, then go back and read it. Wow. Because it's a full chapter. And what I do is I go through the parts of the book that were either BS, like where I'm like, this is what I wrote about, and this is not what history was. Let me tell you the real history. Or I say, this is what I wrote about, and believe it or not, this is true. Let me tell you about it. So in this particular book, one of the side plot points is one of the characters owns a tremendous amount of books. And of course, we know the stereotype of the Dark Ages, and everybody is, eating raw meat and hitting each other with sticks. And I go in at length, I talk about manuscript culture and how, no, absolutely, we had universities at this point, we have books at this point that anybody can reach. So yes, so that's what I'm doing. I've got my framework of my social history of what life would be like. I'm choosing my characters to place within that framework. And as I go, I have to go look up things. I also, what I tend to do is put XXX in the manuscript when I'm like, future Caroline, look this up. I don't want to break the flow. It's your problem. And then
Yeah.
future Caroline goes, past Caroline. We have to go look up so-and-so's eye color now. Or, who was cardinal this year or whatever. So I deal with that afterwards. Clearly, I put in all the specifics. But then at the end is when I go in through my author's note and I say, look, here's the history. We got to talk about this, whether good or bad or true or not. In this book, one of the things in my author's note I point out is it's extremely unlikely that a king would have allowed a widowed countess to choose her next husband, even if her next husband is one of the men that he knows is loyal to him,
Right.
and I went into examples of that because we have those. They got written down because they're countesses.